During the peak days of the 16-bit wars, Nintendo and Sega were squaring off in a fierce battle for video game supremacy. Each had their strengths and weaknesses. So when the Sega CD was released here in the States in October of 1992, Sega finally had the upper hand in the next tech leap for that era.
Hey! You still don't have a Sega CD? Huh? What are you waiting for, Nintendo to make one?
The new format would allow Sega to give gamers full motion videos, games with audio speech, and amazing soundtracks. In other words, a more robust gaming experience overall. Lunar by Game Arts would be the first RPG for that new add-on technology and would be released in Japan in '92 before coming to the States in 1993 thanks to the translation port done by Working Designs. Ys had shown the gaming world what was possible with the CD format years earlier on the Turbo CD. Lunar was supposed to be the next step in the RPG evolution. This title was created in the hopes of utilizing this newer technology to bring a more fluid storytelling RPG experience, enhanced by a few slightly animated cutscenes and some actual voice acting audio sprinkled here and there. The game would go on to become the best-selling Sega Mega CD title in Japan and the second best title overall worldwide for the add-on. So it's only rational that a game that sells and reviews that well would get a sequel. Lunar Eternal Blue would be released in '94 in Japan and 1995 in the States, once again thanks to the translated port completed and published by Working Designs. But the title will be released at the very end of the life of the Sega CD, as both the Japanese and Western ports will be released after the Saturn's launch on both markets. Not exactly the best timing there. What is it with Sega and timing things so horribly? Because of this slight miscalculated decision, Eternal Blue would go on to sell poorly when compared to Silver Star. Of course, it didn't help that the game retailed for close to $100 on release. This was nothing new, of course, as we had seen Sega try a similar pricing strategy when Phantasy Star was released here in the States for close to $80 back in 1987. But that was understandable given that the game was using a 4 megabit card, which was considered huge at that time, and a battery backup, which were things that were considered rare and new back then. The game was still a fun title and was well received overall by the gaming community, especially the quickly rising RPG side. It ended up being one of the top 3 selling Sega CD titles overall, even with the bad timing and the Saturn overshadowing its release into the market. So naturally, after 2 well-received titles, we would get a part 3, right? Well, not exactly. The original team wanted to remake the first Lunar title but using more advanced technology, this time on the 2 32-bit systems making waves, the Saturn and the PlayStation. The team felt many features that more closely reflected their vision were not possible with the limited specs the Sega CD had, and wanted to take advantage of what the new systems brought to the table. But first, Game Arts decided to give the Game Gear a little love. Why? I have no idea, but you know what? Whatever. Lunar Sanposuru Gakuen, which translates to Lunar Magical School, was released in 1996 and is considered a spin-off from the original Lunar story, although technically it does take place just 1,000 years before the original game and was developed by Guys, with Game Arts doing the publishing part. It never got any release outside of Japan and was later ported to the Saturn in 1997 as a remake. A non-official English patch was released for this game in 2009 thanks to Aeon Genesis and some good shit translations. What the hell? The reason why Game Arts handed off the developing chores to Guys for this game because they wanted to keep the Lunar name in the spotlight while they worked on their next project. Lunar Silver Star Story Complete would be the result. This time around, the game would have a ton more animation, jumping from 10 minutes worth to around 50 minutes, and Studio Gonzo will handle the portion of that development. This is the same studio that will go on to work on other animated cutscenes in games like Grandia, Gensuo Suikogaiden, and Phantasy Star Zero. So what we got here was an amazing intro that set the stage for a great remake on an already great RPG. It was released for the Saturn in 1996 before it got ported to the PlayStation in 1998, but we in the States would not get it until 1999. The PlayStation version had all the tweaks that the last Saturn port brought to the table, which was mainly more robust FMV playback segments on top of all the other features the remake had. More animation sequences, enhanced audio, slight improvements on FMV resolution, DualShock support, 15 save states instead of 3, and slight graphical tweaks for actual in-game content. But the video playback resolution on the PlayStation was still slightly less than the Saturn port that worked with the special MPEG card adapter. If you were lucky enough to grab this game back in 1999 or early 2000s, on the PS1 you got not only one great RPG, but an overall nice set of content that made it feel like a true collector's edition. This was thanks to the dedication that Working Designs brought to the table, and Victor Ireland was a big reason for this, being not only president of Working Designs, but worked as head translator and helped to localize the game's content for the Western audience. I'm going to talk more about this individual in a future video because the history of Game Arts and their president is actually quite fascinating. Lunar 2 also received the same amount of care when it released again on the Saturn and PlayStation in 1999 and 2000 in Japan, being packaged with anime slider cards for the Saturn version, and the PS1 getting the hardcover manual with the bonus music CD. But the map for this one was plastic and not cloth like the first one on the PlayStation. That's a shame. It's still a great package to get though. So after the 2 original titles, a slight spin-off, a remake of that spin-off, and 2 remakes for the first 2 games, we arrive at 2002. The PS2, GameCube, and Xbox were the new consoles in the market, and Game Arts could have taken advantage of the new systems and their tech specs in bringing Lunar 3 to reality. Instead, they set their eyes on the Game Boy Advance. As to why, I'm gonna get to that in a bit in this video. Lunar Legend. It was developed by Japan Art Media and released in Japan and here in the States in 2002. However, when it was released here in the States, Ubisoft took publishing duties and it was the first game not to be brought to the States by Working Designs. This title would be another remake of the original Lunar title, only compacted enough to fit inside a Game Boy Advance card to play on the go. It was received by the community as a competent Lunar title on the small screen, but criticized for omitting the great music, animated cutscenes, and audio clips. You dumb sack of nuts, you do realize that this was a Game Boy Advance game, right? You're gonna lose those features. Why are you criticizing that? Makes no sense. But the game alone is still a solid RPG and one of the best for the system. Then in 2005, Japan Art Media once again took developing duties and released Lunar Dragon Song in 2006 for the Nintendo DS. Ubisoft once again took publishing rights here in the US and helped release what would be considered the worst Lunar title up to that time and one of the worst RPG in years due to its broken battle system and small gameplay annoyances like having to choose between experience and items after a battle and losing health when running. What the hell? Why would you do that? It was as if Lunar fans that had stuck with the series for years were all of a sudden getting punished for sticking around waiting for part 3. But fear not people, Lunar was not dead. Game Arts took back developing duties and released... Not part 3, sorry. Lunar Silver Star Harmony. Another remake of the original Lunar game that was released all the way back in '92, mind you. It was getting another remake, a third one. This one was published by Xseed here in the States and was released in 2010. This port had all the bells and whistles of the PlayStation version, but also added an additional prologue segment and a final fight, as well as an isometric view instead of the traditional overhead, remixed soundtracks, and new hand-drawn artwork of the characters. The game was actually well received, but the battle system and overall gameplay mechanics were already starting to wear thin, not only for fans of the series, but to gamers in general, with RPGs now incorporating more robust and tweaked mechanics that went well beyond that of Lunar. The series felt stale and way past its prime, regardless of how well the storyline and cutscenes fit into the overall experience. Then, the series went silent. Until 2024, Game Arts announced a new Lunar title after it had renewed the trademark for Lunar over in Japan. Gamers and fans rejoiced. Could this be the new Lunar title, the Part 3 that had been clamored about for so many years? Of course not. Game Arts went ahead and released a Lunar collection set for the Xbox One, PS4, PS5, Switch, and then the PC. This set includes remakes of the first 2 games from the Sega CD ports all the way back in '92 and '94. Both games offer slight graphical tweaks, small quality of life improvements, widescreen support, and added text and subtitle support for some additional languages. That means that Lunar has been getting remakes for the past 30 years now. Boy, and I thought Capcom back in the 90s was bad. So you can pony up $50 for a digital copy of a game that has already been remade to death, with some added digital features here and there, but nothing coming close to what you got for around the same price back in 1998. And that's digital. If you pay a little bit more and you get the physical copy, well, this includes nothing except the actual game disc and a reversible cover. Wow, this is what's considered a collection nowadays versus this. That's a big difference. Something's not adding up. But if you were following the release of this game closely, you were probably aware of Althena's treasure box, which is a nicely wooden box labeled with the Lunar logo and comes with all these really nice trinkets, but it's gonna cost you an additional $60. Well, it did, since it's no longer available since it was a special pre-order. You might still find it online though. So, why haven't we gotten a true third title in such an iconic series? Well, here's the thing, back in the early 2000s, Game Arts and Studio Alex, which was the studio that co-developed the first 2 Lunar games on the Sega CD, got into a legal battle regarding the rights to Lunar. You see, Studio Alex may have co-developed the game with Game Arts, but they were the driving force behind it all. Studio Alex argued that since they were co-developers, they felt they had secondary developer rights to the Lunar name, and Game Arts never got their permission to develop and release Lunar on the Saturn and the PlayStation without their say, and demanded royalties and compensation for those titles. The ensuing court decision favoring Game Arts caused Studio Alex to go bankrupt. But court proceedings and lawyers aren't cheap, and this exhausted Game Arts too, I am sure. In 2005, Gung Ho Entertainment Online swallowed up Game Arts, as they tend to do.
That's a spicy meatball!
Read up on this company if you can, or keep an eye on my channel as I will be covering this company in the future. Gung Ho at that point got all the rights to Lunar. Many out there have speculated that it was during the late 90s to early 2000s that the idea of a Lunar 3 was floating around. But the court battles for the IP rights hindered, or by all rights, probably killed any plans for its creation. There is an interview that was conducted by LunarNet in 1998 with Victor Ireland that confirms that there was a Lunar 3 in some type of a planning stage, assuming he was telling the truth. But there was a bigger problem Game Arts had to deal with. The loss of Studio Alex meant that the main creators of the series were gone. Game Arts had lost the true creative power behind the Lunar series. Then they had no choice, so they gave the developing duties for the Game Boy Advance and the DS games to Japan Arts Media. Nothing against that company, but they clearly did not understand what made Lunar such a beloved RPG. If they did, Lunar Dragon Song would not exist. Will we ever see a Lunar 3? You know what? I don't think so. The true talent and creative process behind the Lunar series are scattered to the winds, and it takes a hell of a lot of money to create a game from scratch versus just brushing off the dust from an old IP, adding a few new bells and whistles, and charging $50 for a digital copy while slapping the words remastered or collection on it. Plus, the franchise name has been sitting on the shelf way too long, and there wouldn't be too much demand nowadays in such a crowded gaming market, particularly RPGs. Well, that's it folks, thank you all for watching this small trip down the Lunar series and the very brief history of this iconic franchise. Except for the DS game, let's forget that thing exists. Until next video, keep watching and keep gaming.